Good morning. It's great to see such an incredible crowd. And before we get going, just want to, on behalf of all of, not just Richard and I, but all of the writers, thank you all for being the kind of audience you are. We have really, we feed off of your caring and listening and your follow-up questions. And that's part of what makes Rancho Mirage so miraculously. So thank you guys, truly.
Give yourself a hand.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you know, Dr. Richard Haass is one of the go-to people if you have any question about American foreign policy and the world in troubled times. And particularly his last session, he was dealing with this new book, but we're just going to kind of talk about what's on your minds. Where are we at right now in the world? What in the hell is going on in U.S. foreign policy, and what kind of dangerous point are we in? And I'm just going to begin, Richard, and you know, the one that bothers me, I'm most concerned about at this moment is Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I'm worried about what Zelensky can do between now and the spring if he doesn't get more U.S. military assistance, and how Russia seems to be able to endure casualties that are, you know, just hundreds of thousands of Russians dying, meaning their steely determination not to lose this. Where are we at, and what can the U.S. do right now on Ukraine?
Okay, we'll start with that. We have no shortage of things to talk about, unfortunately. Look, we're ending the second and about to begin the third year of this phase of the war, which began 2 years ago in February. The war actually began in 2014 when Russia went into Ukraine and the East, and then you had the invasion of just 2 years ago in February of 2022. Look back against that, this has been an amazing success. The idea that Ukraine, which has 1/3 the population, much smaller military, has held out against Russia, extraordinary accomplishment. Among the people who never thought this would happen was Vladimir Putin. He made the not crazy assessment that this would be a hot knife through butter, given he thought the Ukraine was divided and corrupt and weak. The Europeans were feckless. The Americans were in his pocket and distracted. And he thought his own military was pretty good. He was 0 for 4. Mm-hmm. And not crazy assumptions, just wrong assumptions. And it's been a remarkable 2 years. With, you know, I think at times Ukraine's expectations got too great. I would love for Ukraine to regain all of its territory. It's an important principle of international relations. The reason we went to war, by the way, against Iraq in 1990 and 91. Territory ought not to be acquired through the use of military force. It's a basic organizing principle in the world. But I think Ukraine, with the so-called counteroffensive and the rest this past year, got unrealistically ambitious. Again, I want it to happen. It's not going to happen militarily if it happens. Anyhow, they are where they are. I think it is, for me, not bad. They still control about 80% of their territory. And the last 2 years have not really changed the territorial distribution, really only at the edges. Problem now is a little more than anything is us, is what's going on in the House of Representatives. We are, how would I put it, to some extent snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. I think it's outrageous that this is happening. So the real question this year is, will we ultimately agree to give Ukraine some support? I'm still optimistic we will. I think perhaps with the separation of this issue out from the border policy bill. And again, Ukraine, the definition of success, I would argue, should not be, can Ukraine militarily liberate the 20% it doesn't have? Can it hold on to the 80% it does? And I think the other 20% one day happens, probably not militarily, but in a post-Putin Russia through promises of economic reduction of sanctions, different types of integration, and so it's a long-term proposition. But I think it's essential that Ukraine continue to function and exist as a sovereign, viable state with increasing ties to the EU, increasing ties to NATO. And I think that's all quite achievable, and I think it's, again, compared to what the expectations were 2 years ago, not bad.
What can President Biden do differently, or how can he message what needs to be done to the American people in a resolute way?
Well, he's got to, look, president's not that comfortable using the bully pulpit that is the Oval Office. It's not his, naturally, no one ever confused him with Ronald Reagan or FDR. But it's an important part of a presidency. It's an important part. I mean, if you think about what FDR did with the fireside chats, getting the United States, edging us ever closer to support of the Allies in the run-up to World War II, or Reagan's ability to communicate with the Americans, it's an essential part. Or, I mean, I worked for Reagan, but I also spent 4 years at the White House working for George Herbert Walker Bush. And the way we rallied the American people after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. President needs to work at it harder to explain why it's in our interest and why it's not a diversion of resources. What we've seen in this country is a growth of classic isolationism, almost the old guns versus butter debate. And anything, people forget, just one or two facts. As much as we spend on defense, close to $900 billion a year now, as a percentage of GDP, and Doug knows this, it's only about half of the Cold War average. And the last I checked, during the Cold War, we were able to spend 6, 7 or more percent of our GDP, 8%, and we still did okay, not just in the world, but here at home. Indeed, we were doing better at home then than we are do now. By and large, I've now worked for 4 presidents, much more important than how much you spend is how you spend it. And so our problems domestically are not the money we're spending on foreign policy.
Right.
I'm sorry, I think the president needs to make the case that, yeah, we have real domestic problems, but that's not the cause, and here's why it's in our interest to do this. And by the way, it's a bargain, what we are getting in Ukraine. And, and unlike the Gulf War, last I checked, Americans aren't serving in Ukraine, Americans aren't dying. So this has been, I think, a well-constructed policy.
So you think it's well-constructed policy. You're seeing light at the end of the tunnel. You see Zelensky as being quite a leader of our time, given his situation. Why, and we know what's at hand, so much matters about what happens there. Why is former President Trump working to sabotage our Ukrainian policy? What is it, just a raw isolationist vision, or is it just political punishment to Joe Biden? Why would he want to be on the side of Russia at this point?
Beats me. Look, those are all totally legit questions. All I can say is a little bit, look, it's always dangerous to get into the land of speculation, to ascribe motives, but he has had an infatuation with Putin and other authoritarians, for whatever reason, all that. Second of all, I think, as we see on the immigration debate, his default thing is if Biden wants it, he has to oppose it. So I think there's a little bit of that. I think, look, if you describe yourself, if your mantra is America first, you're the historian, obviously. That's classic isolationism, and I think it does play into the public mood that people know this country's a little bit off the rails. There's a bit of resentment. Mr. Trump, whatever his weaknesses or flaws, is really good at reading resentment and grievance, and I think he's using this to channel some of that. I think it's, look, I think it's truly misguided strategically, and as I said, I think this has been a bargain. I think this has been a strategic bargain, and the cost, and this is something President Biden needs to point out, the costs of not seeing this through are enormous, because you never want to teach the lesson or model the lesson that aggression pays. Shockingly enough, there'll be more of it, and everyone's going to take notes. Putin will take notes, China will take notes, Iran will take notes, and others. But why Mr. Trump, and why so many Republicans who, and so I'd actually say know better. It's not that they should know better. I actually think a lot of them know better. But it's just cynicism. I mean, we're in an age of This is cynicism on stilts. And that's what we're, but I just think that this president has to do a better job of using the bully pulpit on this issue, on the migration issue, and so forth, because I do think this is an argument that can and should be won.
Let's take a look at what happened October 7th with Hamas. A dark day, Israel getting hit in such a murderous incident. How have things transpired since October 7th with how Netanyahu's government's proceeding with its war of ferreting out Hamas military and trying to redefine some borders, trying to also get humanitarian aid in? It's escalating situation all the time. Walk us through how you've seen this play out so far, and where are we at today? What would be the smart moves for both the United States to make, but also Israel?
Look, what happened on October 7th was horrific. It was barbaric. Everything that Israel has done since then just about has been misguided and not in Israel's self-interest or ours, which I'm really sad to say. Yes, Israel, first of all, October 7th never should have happened. It was a real failure of Israeli intelligence and defense policy. So one thing would be, in addition to whatever you might do against Hamas, would be what lessons do you learn from that? How do you make sure it doesn't happen again? It's not that Hamas will change its stripes. You just want to make sure that it can't succeed if it ever tries to do anything again. And that's achievable. That's what deterrence and defense are all about. So I'd say that. I think Israel's response did not sufficiently distinguish between Hamas and Gaza. 25,000 plus people are dead who should not have been killed. Israel should have, I argued at the time, I think it was right then, I think it's right now, should have done a very low-key military combination of covert and very precise military calibrated operations to go after Hamas leaders, to do a much greater job of distinguishing between the population and the leadership. We wouldn't have had the anti-Israeli and anti-American and anti-Semitic reactions around the country and the world if that had happened. Israel still has zero plan for what does it do. It's not only that they'll never get to the day after. The idea of eliminating Hamas is a nonsensical idea given the nature of Hamas. But even if you could, then what? Who's gonna govern and occupy this space where over 2 million people live? And how are you going to reconstruct it so they can go back and live there? What's totally missing from the Israeli policy is not just a plan for Gaza, but a larger political approach that would create a context in which, among other things, the Saudis would come forward and normalize relations with Israel. You need a political dimension here. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about a Palestinian state tomorrow. You have no Palestinian partner. What you need to do is move towards, and that might be a 5 or 10 year process of developing a Palestinian leadership. You'd say, here's the conditions you have to meet. We'll resource you and work with you so long as you meet these conditions about being willing to live with us peacefully and not being corrupt and so forth. Again, the Saudis would participate in that. The Americans would participate in that. This Israeli government will not do that, because this Israeli government doesn't want that. This Israeli government wants a greater Israel, not a greater peace. Let's be blunt. And the United States, I think, gets back to something the president needs to do. I think this president, using the Saudi offer, needs to be much more forward-leaning, go over the head of this Israeli government. I actually been arguing the president should take a page out of Bibi's book. Bibi came to the Congress to undermine the Iran nuclear deal. The president should go to the Knesset, talk to the Israeli people, and basically say, this president's the most popular American in Israel right now. His reaction to October has earned him a lot of goodwill. Well, now's the time to use it and to explain to the Israeli people why Israel is going down a really dangerous path for itself if you want Israel to permanently be a Jewish, democratic, secure, prosperous state, which we all do, or I'd say I do. They're jeopardizing the U.S.-Israeli relationship. We're losing the younger generation of Americans who do not have the same instinctive sympathy for Israel that Joe Biden's generation has. So I'm worried about that. And again, at the end of the day, a Palestinian state, or whatever you want to call it, is not just something that's a favor for the Palestinians, it's a favor for Israel. And that's the argument I think this president needs to make.
Yeah, and do you think the two-state solution still has credence?
Look, remember what Churchill said about democracy? It's the worst form of government, except for all the others. That's the two-state solution. It's the worst approach to the Middle East, except for all the others. Yeah, it's on life support. I've worked on this issue for 50 years. I've lived in Israel. I got my first degree in Middle Eastern studies. I've been part of more American peace teams and peace processes than I know all the options. I do not know any better option, and I say that without in any way underestimating the difficulties in getting from here to there. It was difficult to think about a two-state solution 40 years ago or 50 years. It's incomparably more difficult to think about it now, given how attitudes have changed, settlements, you name it. But again,
let me frame it from a Netanyahu perspective. If he was not doing well in Israel, meaning he was filled with legal troubles and woes, he was messing around with the court system in a serious way. I think there was a myth almost that Israel was a cocoon, that this iron dome, even if you didn't know much about the Middle East, you had heard there's an iron dome protecting Israel and nobody can get in, and they're leading the world in that kind of strategic protection of a country. And maybe the U.S. needs to learn from the Iron Dome. But here, October 7th, it's such a, gliders, bolt cutters, old weapons, going in a kind of a way that's an old-fashioned way, which made the Iron Curtain, that kind of protective technological level moot for a moment there. And now Netanyahu, instead of having egg on his face and being the worst person that's ever been in Israel because he didn't have his country prepared, he had his eyes on other things, is trying to go down to be this ardent Zionist who fulfills a second moment. The creation of Israel first, second is the enlargement, and once and for all, he will be known as the person in history who developed and took over Gaza and had a larger Israeli state, and in that way his historical legacy will grow. Because, do you think that's what he's thinking?
Among other things, yeah.
Yeah.
I think he's evolved. I've known him for decades, but I think his motive initially was to stay in power and stay out of prison, given the corruption charges against him. He's increasingly forged common bonds with really radical right-wing people. I mean, the debate in Israel is not over Palestinian state; it's over Israeli settlement now of Gaza. Just to give you an idea where the conversation. So these people don't want normalization with the Saudis, with strings attached to the Palestinians. They would much more value not having that and having a free hand in the West Bank and Gaza. So those are Bibi's political partners. So either he's become much more right-wing, or he's opportunistically sided with them, and because that's the only political partnership that is available. Too. So that's his agenda. What you were saying. I mean, I think he now says he's all that stands between Israel and a Palestinian state, which he calls Hamastan. It would be a radical Palestinian state. Indeed, he would run against Joe. If the president does what I advocate for, he will then run against it and position himself. I'm all that stands between you, Israel, and this. And Israel's become a more conservative society. It's not a preordained outcome there. He also said he wanted to prevent an Iran nuclear weapon. Well, Iran's a lot closer to it, in part because he's taken his eye off the ball, in part because of the decision by the Trump administration to unilaterally get out of the agreement, even if the initial agreement was somewhat flawed. But there we are. But yeah, I think this is Bibi's. This is now where this is Bibi's legacy. Yeah. It's more of a negative legacy of what he's trying to prevent. And again, what worries me is what it will mean for Israel, what it will mean for its relationship with the region, what it will mean for Israel's relationship with the United States. And I think it's truly ill-advised and misguided, but there you have it.
You mentioned the high favorability ratings of Joe Biden in Israel. It is true, and it is remarkable, and you make a very good point that maybe this is the time to go there and cash in on your currency. But if he went to Israel, would he directly criticize the Netanyahu government?
I wouldn't do that. I would not get involved in that. I would basically lay out a vision. And I think he's thinking of this, whether he goes to Israel or not. I think the president's going to do this sooner rather than later. I know this from various conversations I've had, so I'm not trying to be cute or coy, but there is a major conversation going on within the administration. They know that the president's, how would I put it, playing the friendly uncle, telling Bibi Netanyahu, Israelis, you know, this really isn't in your self-interest. It's certainly not good for us. We really think you ought to do more of this and less of that. It ain't working. The Israelis have essentially said thanks, but no thanks. So the president only has three options under the circumstances. He can condition aid to Israel, and he's reluctant to go down that path. But say you can't get this or you can't use this in certain ways. He could take a much more offensive or aggressive role in the UN Security Council, and the United States, instead of vetoing or abstaining, could begin to fashion resolutions. Or thirdly, he could speak out and use the bully pulpit, common theme here, and try to shape the context, the conversation in which an Israeli election would take place. And I think of the three, I would prefer the third, and that is what is, I think, under the most serious consideration at the White House now.
You've worked with so many precedents on the Middle East, but let's just pick up with George Herbert Walker Bush, and go all the way to.
I think this year is his 100th anniversary of his birthday.
It is. They're going to do a big event there, yeah. and George Herbert Walker Bush 41's 100th anniversary coming up, and you should look into his presidential library at College Station, Texas, where they're doing a symposium and panels. But 41 to Biden on the Middle East, which presidents have really done a good job of framing that part of the world for America's interests?
Well, I think 41 did the best. I mean, he was there at the end of the Cold War, and then with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in the summer of '90, and he saw that as a threat not just to the regional order, but to global order because of the acquisition of territory by force, threat to global energy supplies. And then in the aftermath of kicking Iraq out of Kuwait, he then launched what was the Madrid Peace Conference in October of '91, which was the first time Israelis and Arabs met face-to-face to discuss peace. And it, in some ways, set in motion the modern peace process. It didn't succeed. Ultimately, then it gave rise to the Oslo process and so forth. But I think he had a very good sense that our goal should not be to transform the region, the idea that we were going to leave the Middle East, everybody reading the Federalist Papers in Arabic translation, which in some ways was more the motive of his son's presidency, I thought was massive overreach. I think the President Bush 41 had a more realistic sense of what the United States could accomplish, and a big part of it was to try to push the Israelis and both the Arab states and the Palestinians towards greater normalization. I think subsequent presidents have gotten certain things wrong. Either we overreached on the democratic transformation, which I think had a lot to do with the Iraq War of George W. Bush. I think the Trump administration and several others focused, how would I put it? It was a useful focus, but an inadequate focus to think that peace between Israel and Arab states would somehow survive absent progress between Israel and Palestinians. So I think subsequent presidents missed that piece of it, and I think we've seen it come back with a vengeance.
How should history treat, and what should we think of Bill Clinton's overtures with Yasser Arafat and how close he came? I mean, an inch away, really,
well, I think
from getting a two-state solution, Clinton.
Yeah, I just wish some of those people protesting in this country knew anything about it. Palestinians have had multiple opportunities. I'm not saying everything we did was right tactically. There's some things I think we should have done differently. I don't know if it would have led to a different outcome. But yeah, I think what Bill Clinton and others tried to do and what's so sad is to get those kinds of offers aren't available anymore. And so if it was unacceptable then, even though the Palestinians were going to get back almost all the West Bank and Gaza, and what they didn't get back, they would have compensatory territory and so forth. It was, by current standards, it was such a good deal and so much better than the reality they had or likely will have. It's enough to make you weep. But yeah, I think the Clinton administration, again, you can argue over some of the tactics, but the direction of what they did.
And they were that close for the deal with Arafat, and if I'm not...
And later on, also, they got close with subsequent presidents got close.
But with Arafat at that moment, why did my view is that Arafat became afraid of being the next Anwar Sadat. He was going to get killed.
He said that at one point, and I think that's where one of the things the administration could and should have done differently was lined up a better regional context where someone like an Arafat, who, shall we say, was risk averse, might have been more willing to do something. That I think we didn't line up enough Arab support and so forth to, again, I can't sit here and say if that had happened and this would have happened, but one of the things I've learned, I've been lucky enough to do all sorts. I was the U.S. envoy for Northern Ireland and for Cyprus and some other things. And one of the things I've learned is that when you negotiate, you can't spend all your time simply thinking about the details of what is talked about at the table. That's part of it, but it's not all of it. You've got to spend much more time thinking about shaping the context in which the negotiations across the table take place. So you've got to think about, in the case, say, of an Arafat, what is it we have to do politically, statements, economically, militarily in the region or in the world, so someone like that would be more willing to take certain risks and more likely to succeed if he were to do that. And I think diplomats get too focused on the, if you will, the inside game of negotiations and not enough on the context shaping part of it.
Let's go to a couple different issues, but they're related. Here in the United States, after October 7th, are you surprised at the amount of anti-Semitism that rose to the surface in a very tangible way, and the amount of pro-Palestinian support? Sure. They may be separate, they might be the same thing, but reflect on both of those.
Look, I'm somewhat surprised and certainly worried. I worry about, I think the latter, the lack of support for Israel, I think it's something of a generational change. People my age or older think of Israel. I remember the cover of Life magazine in 1967. It was David against Goliath, and Israel was David. Now, for a younger generation, Israel's Goliath. And they see, all the pictures they see. So they're the instinctive post-World War II, post-Holocaust, embattled Israel era is over. And so the idea that there would be far more sympathy for the Palestinians, less for Israel, is not that surprising. Indeed, that had been a long time in the works. And I had this argument, and I was truly unpersuasive, clearly, but I would talk to American Jewish leaders, and I said, you're playing too much the inside game. Again, you're worried too much about getting votes on the Hill from evangelicals or this or that Jewish group. You're not thinking enough about the next generation in American society. And so long as they could get the votes for aid and all that, I think they ignored the larger conversation way too much for way too long. And we're seeing the bitter fruits of that. The anti-Semitism, that's different. And I think, it's always there in societies. It's worse than I thought. It's depressing and distressing. And it's a longer, separate conversation about what has to happen to combat. That's not a foreign policy issue. That's a societal issue.
You, with a long time at the Council on Foreign Relations and everywhere else, you could be. What would you say right now to a young person that believes strongly in Palestine? They're wanting to wave the flag. They're looking at it from that perspective.
Sure.
Should we be trying to talk to them, educate them? Should we be trying to kick them out of universities? How does one approach this problem that's at least hitting our campuses?
Yeah, I think the main thing is that most of the people on the campus have very little of the historical knowledge. and don't understand what it is. It's not so simple. It's complicated. But you listen to them and somehow it seems very black or white. Well, it's not. And it seems to me they have no empathy or feel for the Israeli narrative, and they overlook many of the flaws in the Palestinian narrative. I mean, how many of these people out there I've looked at the nature of Hamas rule. Well, we talked about Palestinian chances to make peace that were kicked away, or some of what happened on October 7th. So I see a whitewashing or a lack of knowledge of the side they're sympathetic to. I see a demonizing of the Israeli side, and I see a lack of knowledge or understanding of the complexity of the conflict. And I think it's a real challenge. And I've, as recently this past week, talked to educators about it. How is it you try to do this? And it's hard because it's such a loaded, politicized.
Right.
I mean, it's going to be tough to figure out how you have. You know, my other book, my most recent book, what I just had a conversation on early this morning, is about democracy and things like civility and being and so forth. It's tough right now. This is so charged. It's supercharged. And it's got. And I think for university administrators, they've really got to think very hard about what are the rules for discourse on their campuses, and they've got to make sure those rules are applied consistently across controversial issues.
How does one teach tolerance at the schools? How do we at least, or educate on the history of Jewish plight? Is it just as simple as getting courses embedded in, you know, K through 12? Or, I mean, how do we make sure we're not raising a generation of anti-Semites?
Well, there's nothing simple about it. I try to encourage tolerance in Northern Ireland between Protestants and Catholics. I mean, partially there is a historical knowledge dimension, but also you've also got to teach in a democracy something about about acceptable behaviors and effective behavior. You got to teach people how to have arguments and how to get informed and and so on. There's a million types of things you can do in terms of simulations and workshops and mock this and mock that. It's not unique to this issue. Everything we see in this country, that this issue is more simply another manifestation of our difficulty, if not inability, to have serious political conversations across controversial issues, and we see it every day. So yeah, I think it's so you can have Middle East specific education. I think that, and again,
civics education.
But I'm big on civics,
yeah.
and part of civics. And indeed, I think what I've been encouraging college presidents and others to do is when kids come to campus, there's something called first-year experience. And a lot of schools have special programs for when freshmen show up at campuses. Well, for a lot of these young people, this is their first experience, not just away from home, it's their first experience with people who are different than themselves. People who don't go to their church or don't look like them or don't have their same socioeconomic thing or come from different kinds of family structures. Well, why do we assume that they know how to operate in that environment and navigate it and be prepared for all the stuff that's going to come at them politically and intellectually? And I think schools need to do a much better job of preparing people, if you will, as citizens of this community for the next 4 years, as well as citizens of this society for the rest of their lives.
Let's go to the Pacific Theater. Yeah, I agree.
Well, good. I mean, I'm going to make a plug then, because for me, it's the reason I wrote the last book I wrote, The Bill of Obligations. It's the 10 Habits of Good Citizens. I think we've lost sight of it. What it makes, how do we make a democracy work?
Yeah.
And if you don't want to read it, you can watch PBS just did a documentary based on it. But I think in our schools, this has to be a staple. We wouldn't let a kid graduate from high school or college who couldn't read or count. Well, why the hell do we let them graduate if they don't have under their belts the basics of citizenship? We have got to do something about this.
You know, there's the late great historian David McCullough, he felt this deeply, exactly what you're saying. And he always said, and history, of course, is part of it. That's my field. But he said, and geography. You have to know where you're at. I don't care what GPS isn't the only thing. Where are you? What city are you in? What country are you in?
In the last part of, I mean, I've actually been designing a curriculum for high schools and colleges on this. And besides all the stuff you think would go into a civics curriculum, I've added 2 things. One is a whole unit on information literacy. How do you deal with information and misinformation in this era of the internet and all that? And secondly, what Doug was just saying, I've added a whole unit on global literacy. How is it we operate at a moment where what happens out there affects here and vice versa? So you got to know your basic civics and checks and balances and Constitution and Declaration and all that kind of stuff. But you've also got to know those other two things.
Yeah, in geography, Eleanor, they used to say that FDR wasn't an intellectual. He had a first-class temperament's the line, but he's not an intellectual. And Eleanor Roosevelt challenged that to a reporter, and she said, "No, I get what you're saying, but you have to understand, Franklin has an amazing map mind. He would read maps all day long. It was like postage stamps and maps." And so he had that kind of, and the globe spinning. That's why he'd show off in the White House, spin the globe. I can tell you anything about that river or that country. So it was a kind of intelligence that young people need to develop that skill.
You want to go to Asia, you said?
Yeah.
You mentioned
I wanted to go to the Pacific Theater on, and start with something that we don't talk about much. Our great, great ally, Australia, who is now on the process of building nuclear submarines or having bases there. What does that mean? I know in Australia they talk about it a lot.
Well, look, I'm very pro-Australian because my daughter just got engaged to an Australian. So I want to declare my self-interest, and I've just come back from Sydney, and big fan. Look, Australia is one of our central allies, and by the way, allies are the comparative advantage of American foreign policy. Russia doesn't got them, China doesn't got them.
And they have something like a 75, we Americans have 75% approval rating in Australia. Yeah. They love us there.
But I mean, I'd say Australia is not our most important ally in that part of the world. I think by far the most important ally we have is Japan. And Japan is by far the most underestimated country in our orbit. But Australia, South Korea, Taiwan in a different way are all strategic partners full-time. And then you have other countries which are kind of more limited partners. And obviously you got two principal threats in that part of the world. The principal challenge is China, question of how it's going to use its ever-growing power. And then there's North Korea, which is armed to the teeth, both conventional and nuclear. But no, I mean, the great structural advantage of American foreign policy, we began talking about Ukraine, now we're here, is that we have partners. Right. We've got partners in Europe, we've got partners in what's now called the Indo-Pacific. Australia is one of the principal ones. It's also the limited as a partner because it's so far away. That's why I think Japan in some ways is our principal strategic partner in that part of the world.
But for Australia to have that capacity for nuclear submarines, but that country puts them, even forges their alliance with us closer now. They really, I mean, it's a huge step forward for having a defensive perimeter when they're going to be a nuclear.
It's a long ways away. It's a long ways away. Unless someone's going to tow Australia closer to the mainland, it's still going to be pretty far. It's a country of 30-odd million people. So it's interesting, but it's not a decisive. And I don't mean this disrespectfully, but it's a big development, but not a decisive one.
With Japan, we after World War II, and Douglas MacArthur, basically ran Japan. Thought he was going to be able to get it put together by a couple of years. It took 7 years. But the United States helped craft the Constitution. Sure. Of course, we kept Hirohito in. Of course, we elevated the fact that women could be participatory and leaders in their government. And it's a major success story. Why other places, let's say Iraq, that we could go in there 7 years and you don't have much to show for it?
It's a great question. I wrestle with it a lot about why was it that if you use the phrase, became very controversial, nation building or state building, is probably a slightly better phrase, in places like Japan and Germany worked after World War II. And I think partially that these were advanced, modern, industrial societies, very well educated. They were defeated in war and so forth. They had very socially homogenous countries. Well, none of those things apply to most countries in the Middle East. And most of the preconditions of successful modernization and democratization simply weren't there. I mean, this is one of the reasons that I was a skeptic, I'll put it gently, of a lot of what we were doing in the Middle East under George W. Bush, is I was just skeptical that it was ripe or in any way ready for this kind of an effort, but both Japan and Germany. When I just sort of say just quickly on Japan, what hasn't been remarked upon is how Japan has really evolved into a major political military force. We thought of Japan 30 years ago as a big economic power, and we were worried about it so much we were breaking Toshibas on the steps of the Capitol. Japan has done pretty well. It's probably still the third or fourth largest economy in the world despite its shrinking demography. But Japan has become a major political military player. And how to put it, the debate in Japan has broadened considerably to allow it. And Japan has finally become what you might call a post-World War II country with a more normal role in the region and the world. And I'm surprised how little it's remarked upon. Yeah. But China hasn't missed it. And I think Japan is now become central to our thinking, particularly when you look at scenarios involving Taiwan. And Japan is now an integral part of how we would deter or, if need be, push back against certain types of Chinese moves against Taiwan.
Earlier this morning, Admiral McRaven talked about going to Taiwan and walking the beaches and envisioning how could there be an invasion, a China invasion of Taiwan. And his gut told him that's too hard, not going to happen. Yeah. That's not the worry. So then, if we're not looking at that kind of massive invasion of Taiwan, are you seeing eventually, and this might be 2038, but eventually China's main game is to try to do what they did to Hong Kong for Taiwan? Is that where you're or what are they thinking in China?
What's good about making predictions about 2038 is none of you will remember what I said. So if I'm dead wrong, it's like a freebie now.
There'll be tape.
Look, I think let's just sort of break it down. I think in the short run, as in this year, nothing's going to happen. China, I was just in China about 6 weeks ago, whatever. The focus there is all on the economy and their economic problems. The new government just got elected, new president, and he's coming in a few months in Taiwan. He's not going to do something reckless like declare independence. We don't want a crisis there. The bigger question is the medium and long term. Xi Jinping probably has 8 or 9 more years, health permitting, to be in power. Does he decide he has to do something? Hong Kong actually hurt the Chinese with Taiwan. The whole idea of Hong Kong was one country, two systems. And what happened is when Hong Kong reverted, it became one country, one system. So the argument that Taiwan could ever be taken over by the People's Republic of China and keep its separate characteristics, I think the mainland destroyed that notion with what they did with Hong Kong. I think the most interesting development is, I guess, 2 things going on. One is Taiwan, which is a country of 23, 24 million people, thriving democracy, thriving economy, produces most of the advanced semiconductors in the world, increasingly has an identity of separateness. And that's worrisome to the mainland, because almost like Putin looks at Ukraine, it's very dangerous to have an entity next door that speaks the same language, is demographically the same, and has a totally different political and economic path, because it offers up a different example. So I think there's that issue, whether that ultimately makes people on the mainland uncomfortable down the road, and whether there's a kind of impatience. Xi Jinping has said regaining Taiwan is central to what he calls the rejuvenation of China. And if China can't rejuvenate through economic policy or political policy, this is what's left. So look, I don't think we can do anything to influence the mainland's, China's aspirations. What we can do and what foreign policy is all about is influencing their calculations and behaviors. And that's what we ought to do. We ought to basically raise the price militarily, economically, diplomatically. And I think Bill McRaven, as always, is right. I'm not worried about an amphibious assault. That's the hardest kind of thing. Think about it. There's no Chinese general who's fought in a war. Yeah. The last time China fought in a war was in the late 70s against Vietnam, and how did that go? But there's a zillion things they could do less than that, with cyber, with mini blockades, with different kinds of pressures, and so forth. So I think we need to be much more imaginative rather than thinking about the status quo versus an all-out war. What are the gray area scenarios, and what might China do, and how might we respond to those, either to deter them or to respond to them. And I think that's kind of the way to think about how this plays out over the next couple of years or longer.
We're going to have to leave, but I'm asking one last question, but we have to keep it short. The hearings and seeing, about TikTok and this idea of our young minds being polluted by all of this content. How do you feel about a company like TikTok operating the way they do?
I don't much like it. There's stuff on TikTok here that's not in China, but let me make a larger argument. I have watched what the Supreme Court and Congress have done and not done. I see very little appetite to rein in the carriers on the internet, those who provide the pipes, whether it's Facebook or anybody. The key is going to be, how do we make young people critical consumers? How do we teach them information literacy? How do we teach them what to trust, how to navigate it, how to multi-source it, and so forth? So this is an educational challenge. I don't think we can influence the supply. I do think we can influence the filter, if you will, the quality of the demand.
Perfect place to end. Back to K-12 education. Thank you.